The grand ballroom of Whitmore Palace gleamed under the light of 1,000 crystal chandeliers. Prince Edmund stood at the edge of the marble dance floor, his military dress uniform crisp and adorned with ceremonial medals. At 35, he carried himself with the practiced grace of someone born to rule, yet tonight, an unusual tension gripped his shoulders. The annual Royal Charity Gala was in full swing, and the kingdom's most influential families mingled among foreign dignitaries and wealthy patrons. Edmund's eyes swept across the crowd, but his mind was elsewhere, torn between duty and desire, between what was expected of him and what his heart truly wanted. Lady Cassandra Worthington approached with her characteristic elegance, her emerald gown trailing behind her like liquid silk. She had been his companion for nearly 7 years, a relationship that had weathered countless royal scandals and public scrutiny. The daughter of the Duke of Northbridge, she was everything the royal family had hoped for in a future queen: sophisticated, well-connected, and intimately familiar with the demands of royal life. "Edmund, darling," she said, slipping her gloved hand into his arm. "The Prime Minister is asking when we might make our announcement official. The press is becoming quite persistent." Edmund felt the familiar knot in his stomach. Their relationship had been an open secret for years, with royal watchers and tabloids speculating endlessly about when the engagement would be announced. Cassandra had been patient, understanding the delicate nature of royal timing, but even her patience had limits. "Soon," he replied, though the word felt hollow. "Father wants to wait until after the trade negotiations with Valdoria are complete." It was a convenient excuse, one he had used before. King Harold had indeed expressed concerns about timing, but Edmund knew the real hesitation came from within himself. Something fundamental was missing from their relationship, a spark, a connection that transcended duty and social expectations. Across the ballroom, he caught sight of a figure that made his breath catch. Lady Catherine Pemberton stood near the orchestra, her simple navy dress a stark contrast to the opulent gowns around her. She wasn't supposed to be here tonight. As a member of the royal household staff, specifically the palace's chief cultural advisor, she typically worked behind the scenes at such events. Catherine had joined the royal household 3 years ago, bringing with her a brilliant mind and an infectious passion for literature and the arts. She had transformed the palace's cultural programs, organizing exhibitions that drew international attention and establishing scholarship programs for underprivileged youth. Edmund had found himself drawn to her intelligence and authenticity, qualities that seemed increasingly rare in his rarefied world. Their friendship had developed slowly, through late-night conversations about books and philosophy, through shared laughter over absurd court protocols, through moments of genuine understanding that Edmund had never experienced with anyone else. Catherine treated him not as a prince, but as a person, something both refreshing and terrifying. "Edmund," Cassandra's voice pulled him back to the present. "You seem distracted tonight." "Just thinking about the speech," he lied smoothly. In an hour, he was scheduled to address the gathering, speaking about the royal family's commitment to charitable causes. But his prepared remarks felt increasingly meaningless when he was living a lie himself. As they moved through the crowd, stopping to greet various dignitaries, Edmund's awareness of Catherine's presence in the room created an undercurrent of tension. He caught glimpses of her in his peripheral vision, speaking animatedly with the French ambassador about an upcoming cultural exchange, laughing warmly with elderly Lord Harrington about his late wife's poetry collection. The evening's entertainment began with a string quartet performing pieces from the royal collection's rare musical manuscripts. Catherine had curated this particular program, selecting pieces that told a story of love and loss through the centuries. As the haunting melody of a 16th-century ballad filled the ballroom, Edmund felt the music reaching into his chest and squeezing his heart. "She's done wonderful work with this program," Cassandra commented, following Edmund's gaze. "Catherine is quite talented, though I do wonder if she isn't overstepping her role a bit. Some of the older families have mentioned that she seems rather familiar with certain protocols." The criticism stung, though Edmund kept his expression neutral. The old guard's resistance to change was nothing new, but their subtle attacks on Catherine bothered him more than he cared to admit. "Her innovations have brought considerable positive attention to the crown," he replied carefully. "The cultural exchange programs alone have strengthened our relationships with half a dozen nations." "Of course," Cassandra agreed quickly. "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. It's simply that tradition exists for a reason, doesn't it?" The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lord Chancellor Ashford, a stern man in his 70s who had served 3 generations of the royal family. His presence meant business, and Edmund steeled himself for another discussion about his future. "Your Highness," Ashford said with a formal bow. "Might I have a word? There are certain matters of state that require your attention." Edmund excused himself from Cassandra and followed the Lord Chancellor to a private alcove overlooking the palace gardens. Through the tall windows, the manicured grounds stretched into darkness, punctuated by the soft glow of gas lamps along the walking paths. "The cabinet has been discussing the succession," Ashford began without preamble. "Your father's health concerns, while not public knowledge, have made certain preparations necessary. The question of your marriage can no longer be delayed." Edmund had known this conversation was coming. His father's recent heart episode, kept carefully hidden from the press, had reminded everyone that the crown's stability depended on a clear line of succession. "I understand the importance," Edmund began. "Do you?" Ashford interrupted gently. "Because, if I may speak frankly, Your Highness, there have been observations about your recent behavior. Certain attachments that might prove problematic." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Edmund felt heat rise in his cheeks, but years of diplomatic training kept his voice steady. "I'm not certain what you're implying, Lord Chancellor." "The palace staff talk, Your Highness. Late-night conversations in the library, private meetings disguised as cultural briefings, looks that last a moment too long. I'm not making accusations, merely noting that in our position, perception becomes reality very quickly." Edmund stared out at the gardens, his reflection ghost-like in the window glass. He looked like his father at that age, the same strong jaw, the same burden of expectation etched around his eyes. "Lady Cassandra has waited patiently," Ashford continued. "She would make an exemplary queen. The people love her, the press adores her, and she understands what would be required of her. More importantly, she loves you despite the constraints of your position." "Despite them?" Edmund turned from the window. "Shouldn't someone love me because of who I am, not in spite of my circumstances?" "Your Highness, with respect, that is a luxury you cannot afford. The crown is not about personal happiness. It's about service, duty, and the greater good of the realm." The words echoed conversations Edmund had heard his entire life. Duty before desire, service before self, the needs of the many before the wants of the one. He had accepted these principles intellectually, but now they felt like chains around his heart. "I need to give my speech," Edmund said finally. "Of course. But, Your Highness, decisions delayed often become crises managed. The longer this situation remains unresolved, the more difficult it becomes for everyone involved." As they returned to the main ballroom, Edmund saw Catherine near the musicians, quietly coordinating the transition between pieces. She caught his eye for just a moment, offering a small smile that somehow conveyed both warmth and understanding. In that brief exchange, he felt more seen and known than he had in years of public appearances and formal relationships. The announcement came for him to take the podium. As Edmund walked through the crowd toward the small stage, he felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. These people, nobles, diplomats, business leaders, represented the pillars of society that the monarchy existed to serve. Their expectations, their judgments, their needs all pressed down upon him. Standing at the microphone, looking out over the sea of faces, Edmund began his prepared remarks about charitable giving and royal responsibility. But, as he spoke the familiar words about duty and service, his gaze kept returning to 2 figures in the crowd, Cassandra, beautiful and composed, representing everything his position demanded, and Catherine, whose presence reminded him of everything his heart desired. The applause that followed his speech felt hollow, like the sound of rain on a roof while standing in an empty house. As guests began to mingle again, approaching him with congratulations and small talk, Edmund realized that the evening had crystallized something that had been building for months. He was going to have to choose. And that choice would define not only his own future, but the future of everyone he cared about. 3 weeks after the charity gala, Edmund found himself in the palace library at nearly midnight, surrounded by leather-bound volumes and the soft amber glow of reading lamps. It had become his sanctuary, the one place where he could escape the constant pressure of royal obligations and simply exist as himself. Catherine appeared in the doorway, carrying a stack of correspondence from various cultural institutions. She paused when she saw him, her expression showing the same careful consideration she always displayed when they found themselves alone together. "I'm sorry, Your Highness. I didn't realize you were here. I can return tomorrow, please," Edmund said, gesturing to the chair across from his reading table. I could use the company. Unless you have somewhere else to be at this ungodly hour. Catherine smiled as she settled into the chair, setting her papers aside. The Museum of Ancient Arts finally responded about the Byzantine exhibition. They're willing to loan 3 pieces, but they want guarantees about security arrangements that are rather extensive. How extensive? Edmund asked, grateful for the distraction from his own troubled thoughts. They want armed guards for each piece, climate-controlled transport, and insurance coverage that exceeds the GDP of several small nations. Edmund chuckled, the first genuine laughter he'd experienced in days. Perhaps we should simply invade Byzantium and reclaim the pieces ourselves. It might be more cost-effective. I'll add that to the proposal as option B. Catherine replied with mock seriousness. Though I suspect the Foreign Office might object. Their easy banter gradually gave way to comfortable silence as Catherine reviewed her documents, and Edmund returned to his book, a biography of King Edward VIII that he'd been avoiding for obvious reasons. The parallels between his great-uncle's situation and his own were uncomfortably clear. Edmund, Catherine said softly, using his given name as she did when they were truly alone. May I ask you something personal? He looked up from his book, noting the careful way she held herself, as if preparing for something difficult. Always. Are you happy? The question hung between them like a bridge neither dared to cross. Edmund set down his book, studying Catherine's face in the lamplight. Her dark hair had escaped its usual neat arrangement, and her eyes held a concern that went beyond professional interest. That's a dangerous question for someone in my position, he said finally. That's not an answer. Edmund stood and walked to the tall windows overlooking the courtyard. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the ancient stones with white. Happiness is a luxury, Catherine. I have duty, purpose, the privilege of service. Those should be enough. Should be, she repeated quietly. But they're not, are they? The perceptiveness of her observation struck him like a physical blow. In 3 words, she had captured what he'd been unable to articulate to himself for months. My father married for duty, Edmund said, still facing the window. My mother understood her role from the beginning. They built a successful partnership, raised 3 children, served the crown with distinction. By any measure, it was a successful union. But were they happy? Edmund turned back to face her. They were content. They found satisfaction in their shared purpose. That's still not happiness. Catherine rose from her chair and moved closer to him, though she maintained a careful distance. The space between them seemed charged with unspoken words and suppressed feelings. Edmund, I've watched you for 3 years. I've seen you light up when you talk about reforms you want to implement, about ways to modernize the monarchy while honoring its traditions. I've seen your genuine care for people, your frustration with outdated protocols that serve no one. But I've also seen you disappear into yourself whenever the conversation turns to your personal future. What would you have me do? The words came out more sharply than he intended. Abandon everything I've been born and trained for? Disappoint an entire nation? Destroy centuries of tradition for the sake of my own desires? I would have you consider that maybe, just maybe, your happiness matters too. The simple statement landed with the force of a revelation. In 35 years of life, no one had ever suggested that his personal fulfillment was worth considering alongside his royal duties. Catherine, he began, but she held up a hand to stop him. I know what you're going to say, that this is impossible, that we're from different worlds, that duty must come first. And you're probably right about all of it. Her voice carried a sadness that made his chest ache. But I needed you to know that someone believes you deserve to be happy, not just dutiful. Before he could respond, she gathered her papers and moved toward the door. Catherine, wait. She paused but didn't turn around. What if I said that you make me happy? What if I told you that these moments, here in this library, talking with you about everything and nothing, are the only times I feel truly myself? She turned back to him then, and he saw tears glistening in her eyes. Then, I would say that you're the bravest and most honorable man I've ever known, and that Lady Cassandra is very lucky to have found such love. But what if? There is no what if, Edmund. There can't be. You know that as well as I do. The truth of her words cut deep because they matched his own rational thoughts, even as they contradicted everything his heart wanted to believe. The announcement, he said quietly. Father is planning to make it official next month. The engagement. Catherine nodded, her composure remarkable despite the pain visible in her expression. Then, you should focus on that. On building something meaningful with Cassandra. She's a good woman, Edmund. She could make you content, if you let her. Content, he repeated. But not happy. Perhaps that's enough. Perhaps it has to be. After Catherine left, Edmund remained in the library until dawn, staring at the empty chair where she had sat, and trying to imagine a future where contentment could fill the space that happiness might have occupied. The next morning brought a summons to his father's private study. King Harold looked every one of his 71 years as he sat behind the massive oak desk that had served 6 generations of monarchs. His recent health scare had left him frilier, though his mind remained sharp as ever. "Sit down, son," Harold said, gesturing to a familiar chair where Edmund had received countless lectures about duty and responsibility over the years. "Lord Chancellor Ashford tells me there may be some complications regarding your upcoming announcement." Edmund felt his stomach tighten. What sort of complications? The sort that involve members of the household staff and their inappropriate relationships with members of the royal family. The words hit like a slap. Edmund kept his expression neutral through years of practice, but, inside, he felt something crumble. "Father, I assure you, don't." Harold's voice carried the authority that had commanded respect across 6 decades of public service. "Don't insult either of us with denials. You're my son. I know when you're conflicted." Harold stood and moved to the window overlooking the gardens where Edmund had played as a child. The king's shoulders seemed to carry the weight of centuries. "When I was your age, I fancied myself in love with a French actress. Beautiful, intelligent, utterly unsuitable. I spent months torturing myself over the choice between love and duty." Edmund had never heard this story. His father rarely spoke of his younger days, presenting himself as someone who had always known his path without question. "What did you decide?" "I decided that being king meant making sacrifices that ordinary men never have to contemplate. I married your mother, served my country, and built a legacy that you will inherit." The actress married a film producer and lived quite happily, I'm told. "Do you ever regret it?" Harold was quiet for a long moment. "Regret is a luxury kings cannot afford. But I will tell you this, every choice has a cost. The question is whether you're willing to pay it. And if I choose differently than you did, then you must be prepared for the consequences. Abdication is possible, Edmund, but understand what that means. Your brother Charles would inherit a throne he's never wanted or prepared for. The monarchy's stability, built over generations, would be thrown into question. And the woman you choose would bear the burden of being seen as the person who brought down the crown." The conversation ended with Harold's gentle but firm directive. The engagement to Cassandra would be announced in 3 weeks at the annual state banquet. Edmund left his father's study feeling as if his future had been carved in stone, leaving no room for the desires of his heart. That evening, he found Cassandra in her private sitting room at Worthington House, reviewing seating charts for their upcoming engagement party. She looked up as he entered, her face brightening with genuine pleasure at his unexpected visit. "Edmund, what a lovely surprise. I was just finalizing the arrangements for." She paused, studying his expression. "What's wrong?" He sat beside her on the sofa, taking her hands in his. They were soft, perfectly manicured, wearing the family ring that had been her grandmother's. "Cassandra, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. Are you happy? With us? With this life we're building together?" She looked puzzled by the question. "Edmund, we're about to announce our engagement. We're planning a wedding that will be celebrated around the world. Of course I'm happy. But are you in love with me?" The question clearly caught her off guard. She released his hands and smoothed her skirt, a gesture he recognized as her way of buying time to think. "I love you, Edmund. You're kind, honorable, intelligent. We share the same values, the same vision for what the monarchy could become. We make sense together." "That's not what I asked." Cassandra stood and walked to her writing desk, her back to him. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than before. I suppose I love the idea of loving you. I love what we represent, what we could accomplish together. Is that the same as being in love? I honestly don't know anymore." Her honesty was both refreshing and devastating. Here was another person trapped by expectations and duty, another heart compromised by the demands of their position. "What if I told you that I care for you deeply, but that I'm not in love with you either?" She turned to face him, and he saw relief mixed with sadness in her expression. "Then, I would say that perhaps we're both settling for something less than we deserve." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of their mutual admission hanging between them like a bridge they were afraid to cross. "What do we do now?" Cassandra asked finally. "I don't know," Edmund replied honestly. "I truly don't know." The royal state banquet was held in the palace's grand dining hall, a room that had hosted kings and queens, presidents, and prime ministers for over 3 centuries. Tonight, 200 of the most influential people in the realm gathered around tables adorned with flowers from the royal gardens and place settings that belonged in museums. Edmund sat at the head table, resplendent in his formal dress uniform, but feeling like an actor playing a role he no longer wanted. To his right sat Cassandra, elegant in a sapphire gown that complemented the family jewels she wore. To his left, his father presided over the gathering with the natural authority of someone born to command. The dinner conversation flowed around topics of trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and charitable initiatives. Edmund participated when required, offering appropriate responses about agricultural policy and education reform, but his mind was elsewhere. In 3 hours, during the traditional toast to the crown's future, his father would announce his engagement to Cassandra. The news would flash around the world within minutes, making their union not just a personal commitment, but a matter of international interest. Across the room, at a table designated for senior palace staff, Catherine sat with other members of the cultural ministry. She wore a simple black dress that somehow made her more beautiful than all the elaborate gowns around her. Their eyes met briefly during the second course, and Edmund saw in her expression the same mixture of resignation and suppressed longing that he felt in his own chest. "You seem distracted tonight," Cassandra murmured beside him, her voice low enough that others couldn't overhear. "Just thinking about the significance of the evening," he replied. "Our evening," she said softly. "Our announcement." Edmund nodded, though the words felt like stones in his throat. Since their honest conversation the week before, both he and Cassandra had maintained the pretense that everything would proceed as planned. Neither had been brave enough to suggest an alternative that would disappoint so many people and disrupt so many carefully laid plans. The meal progressed through 7 courses, each prepared by the palace's renowned kitchen staff and served with wines from the royal cellars. Edmund tasted nothing. His awareness was entirely focused on the approaching moment when his private life would become public property, when his choice between duty and desire would be made irreversible. During the fish course, Lord Chancellor Ashford approached the head table and whispered something in King Harold's ear. Edmund saw his father's expression tighten almost imperceptibly before he nodded and gestured toward a side door. "If you'll excuse me for a moment," Harold said to his dinner companions. "A small matter requires my attention." As his father left the room, Edmund felt Cassandra's hand find his under the table. Her fingers were cold despite the warmth of the dining hall. "Whatever happens tonight," she said quietly, "I want you to know that I understand. About duty, about sacrifice, about choosing what's right over what's easy." Her words carried a weight that made Edmund look at her more carefully. Cassandra's composed facade showed tiny cracks, a tightness around her eyes, a careful control in her breathing that suggested she was fighting her own internal battle. "Cassandra, what are you saying?" Before she could answer, Harold returned to his seat, though Edmund noticed that the king's usual color had drained from his face. "Is everything all right?" Queen Margaret asked her husband. "A minor diplomatic matter," Harold replied, but Edmund caught the meaningful look his father directed toward him. The dinner concluded with the traditional series of toasts. Foreign dignitaries offered wishes for continued peace and prosperity. Business leaders spoke about economic cooperation. Everything proceeded according to centuries-old protocol until Harold rose for the final toast of the evening. "Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests," the king began, his voice carrying easily through the vast dining hall. "Tonight we celebrate not just the continuation of traditions that bind our realm together, but also the promise of our future." Edmund felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Around the room, guests leaned forward slightly, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. The strength of the crown has always resided in its commitment to service, its dedication to the welfare of our people, and its ability to adapt while maintaining its essential character. Harold paused, his gaze moving around the room before settling on his son. "It is with great pride that I speak tonight about the future of our monarchy. My son, Prince Edmund, has shown throughout his life the qualities essential to effective leadership: compassion, intelligence, integrity, and, above all, the courage to make difficult decisions in service of the greater good." The words felt like a vice tightening around Edmund's chest. In moments, his father would announce his engagement, and the life he had built in his imagination with Catherine would become forever impossible. However, Harold continued, and something in that single word made Edmund's breath catch. Recent conversations have reminded me that true leadership sometimes requires acknowledging when our personal desires conflict with our public duties, and having the wisdom to choose what serves our realm best, regardless of personal cost. Edmund saw confusion spreading across faces throughout the room. This was not the script anyone had expected. Therefore, I am announcing tonight that Prince Edmund will be taking an extended leave from his royal duties to pursue advanced studies in international relations and diplomatic history. This sabbatical will allow him time for reflection and preparation for his future role, while also serving our realm's interests in building stronger relationships with our international partners. The silence in the room was deafening. Edmund stared at his father in complete shock. No sabbatical had been discussed. No leave of absence had been planned. This was improvisation on a level that the royal family never attempted. Harold raised his glass. I ask you all to join me in toasting Prince Edmund's commitment to serving our realm, not just through tradition, but through thoughtful preparation for the challenges that lie ahead. The room erupted in polite applause, though Edmund could see the confusion and surprise on every face. Beside him, Cassandra sat frozen, her champagne flute halfway to her lips. As the evening's formal proceedings concluded and guests began to mingle, Edmund found himself surrounded by well-wishers offering congratulations on his academic pursuit. Each conversation felt surreal, as if he were dreaming while awake. Your Highness, Lord Chancellor Ashford appeared at his elbow. Your father requests your presence in his private study. Immediately, Edmund excused himself from the crowd and followed Ashford through the palace corridors to his father's study. Harold was already there, standing by the fireplace with his back to the door. Close the door, Harold said without turning around. Edmund did as instructed, then stood waiting for an explanation that seemed unlikely to come easily. Do you know what I received tonight, during dinner? Harold asked, finally, facing his son. No, sir. A letter, hand-delivered by special courier from the Archbishop of Canterbury. Edmund felt ice forming in his stomach. The Archbishop's involvement could only mean one thing. Someone had informed the church hierarchy about his feelings for Catherine. The letter expressed concern about rumors circulating within certain circles. Rumors about inappropriate relationships between members of the royal family and household staff. Rumors that, if substantiated, could create a crisis of confidence in the crown. Harold moved to his desk and picked up a single sheet of cream-colored paper. The Archbishop demanded clarification about these rumors before proceeding with any announcements about royal engagements. He felt that the Church's role in blessing such unions required absolute certainty about the spiritual and moral foundation of the marriage. Edmund closed his eyes, feeling the walls of his carefully constructed life crumbling around him. I see, he said quietly. Do you? Harold's voice carried an edge Edmund had rarely heard. Because what I see is a future king who has allowed personal feelings to compromise not just his own position, but the stability of the institution he's sworn to serve. Father, nothing inappropriate has happened between Catherine and me. We've never. It doesn't matter what has or hasn't happened, Edmund. In our position, perception is reality. The fact that rumors exist at all is evidence that boundaries have been crossed, judgment has been compromised. Harold moved closer to his son, and Edmund saw something in his father's eyes that he had never seen before, disappointment mixed with genuine pain. I gave you an out tonight, Harold continued. A sabbatical allows time for this situation to resolve itself quietly. Miss Pemberton can accept a position with the Cultural Ministry in Paris, a promotion that removes her from the palace while advancing her career. You can spend a year abroad, gain some perspective, and return ready to fulfill your obligations. And Cassandra? Lady Cassandra is a remarkably intelligent woman. She understands that an engagement announced under current circumstances would be tainted from the beginning. The sabbatical allows all parties to save face while addressing the underlying problems. Edmund sank into a chair, feeling the weight of 35 years of royal expectations crushing down upon him. What if I refuse? Then, you force my hand in ways neither of us would prefer. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Abdication had been mentioned before as a theoretical possibility, but now Edmund understood that his father was prepared to make it a practical reality. How long do I have to decide? The sabbatical begins next week. Miss Pemberton's transfer has already been arranged. These are not decisions, Edmund. They are necessary actions to protect the crown. As Edmund left his father's study, he felt as though he were walking through a world that had fundamentally changed while he wasn't looking. The life he had known, the possibilities he had imagined, the future he had begun to hope for, all of it was being systematically dismantled by forces beyond his control. In the corridor outside the study, he found Cassandra waiting for him. Her earlier composure had cracked, and he could see the strain of the evening in her posture. "I heard about the sabbatical," she said softly. "About Catherine's transfer." Edmund nodded, not trusting himself to speak. "Edmund, I need you to know something." Cassandra stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I've known about your feelings for Catherine for months. I've seen the way you look at her, the way you light up when she enters a room. I've watched you become more yourself in her presence than you ever are with me." "Cassandra, let me finish." Her voice was gentle but firm. "I could have said something earlier, could have forced this confrontation months ago. But I didn't because I hoped that duty would be enough for you, just as it has always been enough for me." She paused, and Edmund saw tears glistening in her eyes. "But watching you tonight, seeing the pain in your face when your father announced the sabbatical, I realized something. Duty without joy becomes just another form of prison. And I care about you too much to trap you in that." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that when you return from your sabbatical, I won't be here waiting. I'm going to decline any future proposals, Edmund. I'm going to find someone who loves me the way you love Catherine, completely, passionately, without reservation." As Cassandra walked away, leaving Edmund alone in the corridor, he realized that the evening had changed everything for everyone involved. His father had protected the crown through strategic misdirection. Cassandra had chosen her own happiness over social expectations. Catherine was being sent away to preserve everyone's reputations. And Edmund was left to decide whether protecting the monarchy was worth sacrificing the only love he had ever known. The morning of Catherine's departure dawned gray and cold, with autumn rain streaming down the palace windows. Edmund stood in his private chambers, watching the courtyard where official vehicles waited to transport staff members to their various destinations. In 20 minutes, Catherine would leave for Paris, and he would begin his own journey to Oxford for a sabbatical that felt more like exile. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. His valet, Robert, entered with the final preparations for travel, documents, contact information, and a sealed envelope that bore no official markings. "From Miss Pemberton, Your Highness. She asked that I deliver it personally." Edmund's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in Catherine's familiar handwriting. "My dearest Edmund, by the time you read this, I will be on my way to Paris, and you will be preparing for your own journey. I want you to know that these 3 years at the palace have been the most meaningful of my life, not because of the work I've done, but because of the friendship we've shared. I need you to understand something. I don't consider this ending a tragedy. What we've experienced together, the conversations, the laughter, the moments of genuine connection, these are gifts that no one can take away from us. We have been fortunate to know what it means to truly understand another person, even if circumstances prevent us from acting on that understanding. Your father is right to protect the crown. You are right to honor your duties. And I am right to accept this opportunity in Paris, not as punishment, but as a chance to build something meaningful with my life while preserving what we've shared. Please don't carry guilt about this situation. Love is never wrong, Edmund, even when it cannot be acted upon. The fault lies not in our feelings, but in the impossible circumstances that surround them. I will think of you always with gratitude and affection. Be happy, my dear friend. Find joy wherever you can. And remember that somewhere in Paris, someone believes you deserve all the happiness in the world. With all my love." Catherine. Edmund read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in his jacket pocket, close to his heart. Through the window, he could see Catherine emerging from the palace's side entrance, carrying a single suitcase and accompanied by 2 officials from the cultural ministry. She looked up at his window for just a moment, and even from that distance, he could see her smile, warm, genuine, and somehow managing to convey both sadness and hope. She raised her hand in a small wave, and Edmund pressed his palm against the glass in response. Then, she was gone, stepping into the waiting car that would take her to the airport and out of his life. 2 hours later, Edmund found himself in his father's study for what might be their final private conversation for months. Harold looked older than his years, the strain of recent events having carved new lines around his eyes. "The car is ready for your departure," Harold said, though his tone lacked its usual authority. "Father, I need to ask you something before I leave." "Go ahead. Do you ever regret the choices you made? The actress you mentioned, the life you didn't choose?" Harold was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on a portrait of Edmund's grandfather that hung above the fireplace. I regret the pain those choices caused, he said finally. I regret that duty so often requires sacrifice from good people who deserve better. But I don't regret choosing to serve something larger than myself, even if that service required you to give up love. Edmund, I've loved your mother for 43 years. It may not have been the passionate romance of novels, but it has been a love built on respect, shared purpose, and genuine affection. That kind of love has its own value. But you still think about her. The actress. Harold's smile was sad but genuine. I think about many paths not taken, son. That's human nature. But dwelling on what might have been is a luxury that kings cannot afford. What if I'm not strong enough to be that kind of king? Then, perhaps it's time to consider whether being king is truly what you want. The words hung in the air between them like an ultimatum. Edmund had never heard his father suggest, even obliquely, that abdication might be a viable choice. You would support such a decision? I would support whatever decision allows you to live with integrity and serves the greater good of our realm. If you believe that Charles could serve as effectively as you could, and if you believe that your own happiness is worth the constitutional crisis that would follow, then, yes, I would support your choice. Edmund felt something shift inside his chest, as if a door he hadn't known existed had suddenly opened. But, understand, Harold continued, that such a decision cannot be reversed. Once you abdicate, you cease to be heir to the throne. Your children, if you have them, would have no claim to succession. You would be free to love whomever you choose, but you would also be giving up the platform to serve your country in the way you've always dreamed. The complexity of the choice felt overwhelming. Edmund thought of the reforms he wanted to implement, the charitable initiatives he hoped to expand, the ways he had envisioned modernizing the monarchy while preserving its essential strengths. All of that would be lost if he chose love over duty. How long do I have to decide? The sabbatical will last 1 year. When you return, you will either announce your engagement to an appropriate partner and assume your full role as heir, or you will formally abdicate in favor of your brother. There will be no further delays. As Edmund left the palace for Oxford, he felt as though he were leaving one life and entering another. The weight of the decision ahead pressed down upon him, but for the first time in months, he also felt something resembling freedom. For 1 year, he would not be the heir to the throne. He would simply be Edmund, free to think clearly about what kind of life he wanted to build. The drive to Oxford took 3 hours through countryside that was brilliant with autumn colors. Edmund sat in the back seat of the unmarked car, watching the landscape change from formal palace grounds to working farms to the academic spires of one of England's greatest universities. His temporary residence was a modest apartment near Christ Church College, a far cry from the luxury of royal residences, but infinitely more comfortable than the emotional prison he had been inhabiting. That evening, as he sat by the fireplace reading Catherine's letter for the dozenth time, he began to understand what the next year might offer him. Not exile, but perspective. Meanwhile, in Paris, Catherine stood on the balcony of her new apartment overlooking the Seine, holding a glass of wine and watching the lights reflect on the water. Her position with the French Cultural Ministry was everything she had hoped for professionally: stimulating work, international colleagues, opportunities to create programs that would reach thousands of people. But, as she looked out over the city of light, her thoughts were in England with a man she loved but could never have. She had meant every word of her letter to Edmund. She didn't regret their connection, didn't consider their love a mistake. But she also understood that some gifts come with impossible conditions attached. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her sister. "How is Paris? Are you settling in well?" Catherine typed back, "Paris is beautiful. I think this is exactly where I need to be." It was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. Paris was where she needed to be to build a life that wasn't defined by what she couldn't have. Here, she could honor what she had shared with Edmund while creating something meaningful with her future. Back in England, Cassandra sat in her family's estate, composing a letter to a childhood friend who had recently invited her to visit Italy. For the first time in 7 years, she was free to travel without considering royal obligations, free to meet people who knew nothing about her expected engagement to a prince. The letter was difficult to write because it meant acknowledging that the life she had planned was over, but it was also liberating. She had spent so many years being the perfect royal girlfriend that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to make choices based on her own desires. "Dear Victoria," she wrote, "I would love to accept your invitation to visit Tuscany. I have some news to share with you, and I think a change of scenery would be perfect for new beginnings." In his apartment at Oxford, Edmund closed Catherine's letter and walked to the window overlooking the college grounds. Students hurried across the quad in the evening darkness, their lives full of possibility and choice. For the first time in his life, Edmund envied them, not their youth, but their freedom to make mistakes, to follow their hearts, to choose love over duty without bringing down centuries of tradition. But, as he stood there, he also thought about his conversation with his father, about Charles and his unsuitability for the throne, about the reforms and initiatives that would die if he abdicated. The choice between love and duty was not just personal. It would affect millions of people who would never know his name but would live under the monarchy he either led or abandoned. The year ahead stretched before him like an unmarked road. At its end, he would have to choose not just between Catherine and the crown, but between the man he was and the king he was meant to be. For now, that was enough. For now, it was sufficient to know that the choice would be his to make. As midnight approached, marking his first day of freedom from royal obligations in 35 years, Edmund made a decision. He would use this year not to agonize over his impossible choice, but to discover what kind of man he truly was when stripped of titles and expectations. Only then could he decide what kind of life would be worthy of both his heart and his conscience. 1 year later, Edmund stood in the same palace corridor where he had said goodbye to Catherine, but everything had changed. The sabbatical had transformed him in ways he hadn't expected, not through dramatic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of insights that came from living as himself rather than as an heir to the throne. At Oxford, he had researched constitutional law and diplomatic history, but, more importantly, he had learned to wake up each morning without the weight of royal expectations pressing down upon him. He had formed friendships with professors and graduate students who valued his mind rather than his title. He had discovered that he could be useful in the world without being a prince. The letters had helped. Catherine wrote from Paris every few weeks, warm, intelligent correspondence about her work with the French Cultural Ministry, about exhibitions she was organizing, about the way she was building a meaningful life in a new city. Her letters were never romantic in the traditional sense, but they carried an undercurrent of love that sustained him through the most difficult moments of his exile. Cassandra had written as well, sharing news of her travels through Italy and her growing relationship with an archaeology professor she had met in Rome. Her letters sparkled with happiness in a way that her conversation never had during their 7 years together. Reading about her newfound joy had convinced Edmund that ending their relationship had been an act of kindness rather than cruelty. Now, as he prepared for the meeting that would determine the rest of his life, Edmund felt a clarity he had never experienced before. The choice between love and duty no longer seemed like an impossible dilemma, but rather like a question with a clear answer that he had been too afraid to acknowledge. King Harold waited in his private study, looking healthier than he had a year ago. The stress of the succession crisis had eased once Edmund departed for Oxford, and the breathing space had benefited everyone involved. "You look well," Harold observed as Edmund took his familiar seat across from the king's desk. "I feel well. The year away has been enlightening. And have you reached a decision about your future?" Edmund had rehearsed this conversation dozens of times during his journey back from Oxford, but now that the moment had arrived, the words felt both natural and momentous. "I have. But first, I need to tell you about something I learned during my research." Harold raised an eyebrow but gestured for Edmund to continue. "I spent considerable time studying the constitutional changes that followed Edward VIII's abdication. The reforms that were implemented to strengthen the monarchy, the ways the institution adapted to survive the crisis. Yes, those were difficult but necessary changes. What struck me, though, was how much stronger the monarchy became after it proved it could survive such a fundamental challenge. The people's respect for the crown actually increased when they saw that even kings were subject to principles larger than personal desire." Harold leaned forward slightly, intrigued by the direction of the conversation. "I also studied Charles's military service, his work with veterans organizations, his genuine passion for environmental conservation. He's not the same uncertain young man he was 10 years ago, father. He's developed into someone who could serve effectively, if differently than I would." "Edmund, what are you telling me?" "I'm telling you that I've learned the difference between sacrificing for duty and serving from joy. This year has shown me that I can be useful to the world as something other than a king, and that Charles can serve the crown in ways that might surprise everyone." Edmund stood and moved to the window, looking out at the gardens where he had played as a child and dreamed of the future he would inherit. I'm also telling you that I love Catherine Pemberton with every fiber of my being, and that a lifetime without her would be a lifetime spent in service to something I could never fully embrace. Harold was quiet for several minutes, absorbing the implications of his son's words. You're choosing abdication. I'm choosing love and purpose over duty without joy. I'm choosing to serve my country in whatever way I can while also serving my own conscience. The constitutional crisis will be manageable, just as it was in 1936. Parliament will adapt, the people will understand, and the monarchy will survive because institutions are always stronger than individuals. Harold rose from his chair and joined Edmund at the window. Father and son stood side by side, looking out at the realm that one of them would soon renounce. There's something you should know, Harold said quietly. I've been having conversations with Charles over the past few months, preparing him for the possibility that he might inherit sooner than expected. How did he respond? Better than I anticipated. Your brother has grown into his role in ways that weren't apparent when you were both younger. He's ready, Edmund. Not eager, perhaps, but ready. The relief Edmund felt at those words confirmed that he had made the right choice. The crown would be in capable hands, even if they were different hands than tradition had planned. When will you announce the abdication? Soon. But first, there's someone here to see you. Harold moved to his desk and pressed an intercom button. Please send her in. Edmund turned from the window, his heart hammering as the study door opened, and Catherine stepped inside. She looked exactly as he remembered, intelligent, warm, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with formal elegance, and everything to do with genuine spirit. Hello, Edmund. Catherine. Her name felt like a prayer. What are you doing here? Your father contacted me last week. He said you might have something important to tell me, and that I might want to hear it in person. Edmund looked between Catherine and his father, understanding that Harold had orchestrated this moment with the same careful planning he brought to matters of state. Father, the formal abdication will be announced tomorrow, Harold said. Tonight is for personal business. Harold moved toward the door, pausing only to place a hand on Edmund's shoulder. For what it's worth, son, I'm proud of your choice. It takes courage to follow your conscience when the world expects you to follow tradition. After Harold left, Edmund and Catherine stood facing each other across the room that had been the setting for so many momentous conversations. He told me about your research, Catherine said softly. About your conclusion that Charles could serve effectively. Did he tell you about my other conclusion? That you love me? She smiled, and it was like sunrise after the longest night. No, he didn't need to tell me that. I've known it for years. Then, you also know that I can't offer you the life of a royal consort. No palaces, no state dinners, no tiaras or titles. Catherine stepped closer to him, and Edmund felt his heart racing the way it had during their first conversation in the palace library. Edmund, do you remember what I told you that night in the library? That you deserve to be happy. Yes, I meant it. Not happiness as a prince or as a king, but happiness as Edmund. The man who lights up when he talks about educational reform, who makes terrible jokes about Byzantine security requirements, who reads biography until 3 in the morning because he's trying to understand how to live with integrity. Catherine, I'm not finished. She reached for his hands, and the touch sent electricity through his entire body. I've built a wonderful life in Paris. Meaningful work, good friends, a sense of purpose that fulfills me. I don't need you to complete my life, Edmund. I want you to share it. What are you saying? I'm saying that I love you for who you are, not for what you were born to be. I'm saying that a life with you, even without crowns or palaces, would be the greatest adventure I could imagine. Edmund felt tears starting in his eyes as he pulled Catherine closer to him. I love you, he whispered against her hair. I love you so much that giving up the throne feels like the easiest decision I've ever made. And I love you enough to know that if you ever regret that decision, I'll help you find ways to serve your country that don't require wearing a crown. As they held each other in the room where Edmund had learned about duty and sacrifice, he realized that he had found something his father had never experienced, love that enhanced rather than competed with his sense of purpose. The next morning, King Harold announced his son's abdication to a stunned nation. Prince Charles, now heir apparent, delivered a thoughtful speech about his commitment to environmental stewardship and veteran support that surprised critics and reassured supporters. Edmund, now simply Mr. Edmund Windsor, married Catherine in a small ceremony at Oxford's Bodleian Library 6 months later. Their wedding made international headlines not because of its grandeur, but because of the obvious joy radiating from both bride and groom. 5 years later, Edmund established the Windsor Institute for Educational Reform, a foundation that developed innovative programs for disadvantaged youth across Europe. Catherine served as the Institute's director of cultural programming, creating arts education initiatives that reached thousands of children annually. They lived in a comfortable house in the Cotswolds, traveled frequently for their work, and never once regretted the choice to put love before duty. Edmund discovered that serving his conscience and serving his country were not mutually exclusive. They were simply different expressions of the same fundamental commitment to making the world better. King Charles proved to be an effective monarch, bringing passion and innovation to environmental issues while maintaining the dignity and stability the crown required. The constitutional crisis that many had feared never materialized, and the monarchy's ability to adapt to unexpected change actually strengthened public confidence in the institution. On quiet evenings, Edmund and Catherine would sit by their fireplace reading, just as they had in the palace library years before. Sometimes Catherine would look up from her book to find Edmund watching her with the same expression of wonder he had worn the night he chose love over everything else he had been taught to value. "Any regrets?" she would ask. "Only that it took me so long to understand that happiness and duty don't have to be enemies," he would reply. And in the comfortable silence that followed, surrounded by books and memories and the promise of tomorrow's shared adventures, both of them knew that some fairy tales do come true, just not in the ways that stories usually tell them.